Hey YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. Today I want to talk to you about the majority text. And I don't mean the majority text as a collection of stuff put together in a specific edition, though I do want to touch on that. I want to talk about what we mean by when we say majority text, because I've heard a lot of people say the term, and I think just about every single one of them has used it in slightly a different way. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So before I started recording this video, I had reached out to a couple friends of mine on Facebook Messenger just to ask them, what would you say the majority text is? And let me just share with you some of the results because they're rather interesting. So from Peter Gurry, he writes, simple. The majority text is the text found in the numerical majority of manuscripts at each point of variation. Okay. Right? So wherever there's, a majority agreement on a specific reading, okay, that's good. And so I asked Elijah Hixson, and Elijah said the text of the New Testament that at every point where there is known variation in the manuscripts, it agrees with the numerical majority of Greek manuscripts. And then, of course, he qualifies that about the data that we have. So that's interesting. Peter and Elijah are very close. And I actually asked Elijah if they colluded on their definition. They did not. But nonetheless, they came out with relatively similar. But there was a difference there. Peter didn't mention anything about the language. He didn't mention anything about Greek manuscripts. Again, I don't know if it's because I just pressed him for just a quick definition or not. But Elijah did manage the numerical majority of Greek manuscripts. So he does make that distinction there. And that's an important distinction. Now, as many of you know, Matthew Everhard just recently came out as a majority text advocate. And this is what he wrote. So he gave me a much longer, much more thought out answer. I was kind of hoping for a quick one, but that's okay. So I'll just read to you what he put here. And so he writes, unlike some others, I define the majority text as the vast numerical agreement of the manuscripts across all text types to combine to yield a great, preponderant, and largely unified witness to the authentic text. I do not merely define majority text as the Byzantine text form, though many do, precisely because I want all text types to be included in collation data analysis. The Alexandrian texts are particularly valuable when a consensus is not clear, such as in the book of Revelation, since the antiquity would be my number 2 criteria immediately behind number 1 majority and ahead of number 3 ubiquity. So Matthew Everhard is not arguing for a pure majority text. He's arguing for a mostly majority text with a couple other caveats. Now, I'm not here to criticize his position. I just want to compare the different definitions of majority text. So now with Matthew Everhard out of the way, I asked Bryan Ross. You'll see that I'm catching a variety of different viewpoints here. And Bryan Ross, again, not wanting to simplify the answer too much, writes this one. And I'm probably mostly in agreement with Bryan here. And he writes, the term or phrase majority text has both a loose and tight meaning or application in discussions related to the text and translation. Many use the term loosely to refer to the vast majority of extant Greek manuscripts in a general sense. When used in this sense, it is generally applied to the Byzantine text, which is witnessed in the vast majority of extant Greek manuscripts when compared with minority text or Alexandrian text. In this usage, it is meant to underscore the number of textual witnesses that speaks to the TR King James tradition as the most widely attested form of the New Testament text in contradistinction to the comparably few textual witnesses upon which the modern critical text is based. Whew. Okay, but I'm not done yet. In the tightest, strictest sense, the majority text refers to the printed edition of the Greek New Testament first edited by Zane Hodges and Arthur Farstad and published by the Thomas Nelson publishers in the early 1980s. In the tight sense, the term is referring to a specific printed edition of the Greek New Testament. Okay. If you've seen Bryan's stuff, okay, this guy is absolutely thorough to a T. Now, I would agree mostly with Bryan's definition of the 4 that I've seen here so far. But even that is slightly deficient because what I'm trying to do here is not necessarily to define the term majority text, but just to kind of capture some of the ways in which that it's been used. So I'm going to posit the idea that the term majority text is used in 3 ways. And if you've been paying attention through my readings of what the others were suggesting, Bryan Ross gives us 2. The first one is by far the easiest one to refer to, and that is this guy here. It's literally the Greek New Testament according to the majority text, and this was edited by Hodges and Farstad in the 1980s. This is the 2nd edition here. But yeah, so when you say the majority text, capital M, capital T, we're talking about this guy here. Now, the second way that majority text is often used is to categorize a number of manuscripts. And typically what happens is when we categorize these manuscripts as a majority text, or when we find out which manuscripts contain the most of a specific reading, it almost always ends up being a Byzantine type reading. Now that makes sense because for the most part, the Byzantine text type makes up approximately 90% of all the extant Greek manuscripts. So let me grab a quote here from the Robinson-Pierpont Greek New Testament preface. He writes, "Of the over 5,000 total continuous text and lectionary manuscripts, 90% or more contain a basically Byzantine text form." So right off the start here, okay, 90% of all the manuscripts that we have are basically a Byzantine text. So that means that if you're going to get a majority text and do all the nose counting and everything, you're going to end up with a Byzantine text. Now, there are some differences between the Hodges and Farstad text and the Byzantine text form put together by the Robinson and Pierpont. However, the differences are minor and they're essentially representing the same text. So it's a rather interesting comment. Maybe in another video we'll do a comparison between the 2 editions because there are some differences in process in how the Greek editions are put together and how the collations are looked at and how the data is analyzed. But we're not going to go there just yet. So the second way that majority text is often used, and this is the way that I have found in writings pre-Hodges Farstad, is people like D.A. Waite or Dean John Burgon. They've always referenced the majority text, but not as a majority of text. They always reference it as the majority of manuscripts. Right? That's the specific term there, majority of manuscripts. They don't use the term majority text in the same way that we do. But if you go a little bit later and you look at the writings of Ruckman and Gipp and so on and so forth, they will refer to the majority text as the Textus Receptus. So it's almost, sometimes they make a little bit of a distinction there, but for the most part, they're referring to the majority text as the Textus Receptus. So when you hear them say majority text, they're talking about the Textus Receptus. Now, an interesting one I found was in reading E.F. Hill. So in the King James Version Defended, he makes a distinction between the Textus Receptus and the majority text. And in his writings, he talks about how the majority of Greek manuscripts preserved God's word mostly. From the Orthodox Church in the East, we have all those manuscripts coming down. That's why they're Byzantine type manuscripts. He went on to call that the majority text, but then his theory was that the majority text needed a little bit of work. Okay, needed a little bit of correcting. And so when Erasmus came in the 1500s to do his work on the Textus Receptus, he used the Latin Vulgate to make those corrections to the majority text, and hence you had the TR come out as its own sort of thing. Now, I'm inclined also to take the term majority text and think of it as a bundle of printed editions. So in a very similar way in which the confessional bibliology guys will refer to the Textus Receptus tradition as a number of printed editions as opposed to a specific one, the term majority text can also be used in this sense where we have a number of printed editions that sort of make up that tradition. And I would include the Hodges Farstad text, obviously, the Robinson-Pierpont text, the Byzantine text form. I would include Pickering's Family 35 in that. And I would also include the Textus Receptus in that. I think the Textus Receptus is a good representation of the majority text. Now, this gets really interesting because although we keep talking about majority text and we hear that term a lot, I don't usually refer to myself as a majority text advocate. And there's a reason why. So you probably heard me refer to myself as a Byzantine prioritist. And I think because the term Byzantine prioritist is a little bit more clear on where we stand. So the term majority text, as we've knocked out about 3 different ways it's used, there's actually a 4th way it's used, and that is in a purely mathematical sense. It's totally theoretical, and that is that it's the literal majority counting of each Greek manuscript. And it's important to recognize that when we refer to the majority text, it's always just the Greek manuscripts, right? If we were to tag on like the Latin versions or the Gothic versions, the Armenian versions, or the Peshitta or whatever it is, the Coptic version, if we were to include all those in our calculations of what the majority text is, it's almost guaranteed that majority text would be different, much more different than the Hodges and Farstad text. So when we refer to majority text, it's always just Greek manuscripts. We don't typically touch versional information on that. Like I was saying earlier, I typically don't like the term majority text, and here's why. If you take a look at the preface to the Hodges and Farstad text, it gives you a few things about how they worked their scholarship and created the body of the text. So they gave us 2 premises in selecting the readings to go into the body of this text, right? So the first one is any reading overwhelmingly attested by the manuscript tradition is more likely to be original than its rivals. This observation arises from the very nature of manuscript transmission in any tradition where there are not major disruptions in the transmissional history. The individual reading, which has the earliest beginning, is the one most likely to survive in a majority of documents. So that's part 1. The Greek New Testament according to the majority text is going to be mostly majority reading, nose counting, mostly. Now, you do run into some issues when you do that. Why? Because the variants in the New Testament don't always line up nicely to have a nice big majority. Sometimes they're split 3 or 4 or 5 times, and then what you're looking at is a plurality. So in Canada, we have a funny political system. We have a 3-party system. Well, it's more like 4 or 5, depending on how you count some of the other parties. But what that ends up doing is you end up splitting the vote 3 ways. So when election period comes and our prime minister is elected, the prime minister usually gets elected based on a minority of votes. Usually the prime minister wins based on somewhere between 35 and 39% of the vote. Very rarely does a prime minister get elected with more than that. So that doesn't bode well for a majority. So what this means is that a majority isn't always going to cut it, and you need other principles to make decisions based on readings. Sometimes you can take the plurality, but then the plurality is so close with the other readings that you're really just throwing it up in the air. So again, some principles need to be applied. Now, the other thing here, part 2, the second premise that they talk about was where I found it more interesting, because in this, what we find out is that the Hodges-Farstad majority text, it wasn't their prime ambition to create a text based on a majority. Okay, and here's what I mean. The second premise involved in selecting readings reads this: final decision about readings ought to be made on the basis of a reconstruction of their history in the manuscript tradition. So in other words, what they want to do primarily, firstly, most importantly, is to develop a genealogy and then base the readings off of that genealogy. Now, if you read through the preface, it's really interesting because what you find is that the editors wanted to do the genealogical method. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of the genealogical method, but they essentially came to the conclusion that we didn't have enough data to do that. So in order to do these genealogical methods, you need essentially a full collation of every single manuscript that is available. And in the 80s, that certainly was not available. So in the interim, it seemed that the best solution was to use a majority reading. And then the majority reading would more closely reflect what a genealogical method would produce. So it's strictly statistical. Now, I found that to be interesting. And I think this sort of shares why I don't necessarily like the term majority text, because I think by saying majority text, we give the wrong impression that it's strict nose counting, and clearly it's not. So we have a consensus text for sure, but then there's many instances where other principles of textual criticism have to work in order to make a selection on a reading. Now, this also makes sense because the book of Revelation provides a rather difficult challenge when it comes to textual criticism. But the benefit of it, though, is someone had already done complete collations of the book of Revelation. And so the Greek New Testament, according to the majority text, had used the work of Hodges in order to determine a stemma and a genealogy for the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation in the Hodges Farstad majority text is actually based on a genealogy from Hodges' work and not necessarily a majority text. And then the other part in the Hodges Farstad text is the Pericope Adulterae. And again, a mostly full collation existed, or at least enough usable data was in existence to be able to do the same genealogical method. And of course, you can read a little bit more about that in the preface to the majority text. So anyway, lots of stuff to talk about there. I just wanted to come in, and I don't think I necessarily cleared the air. I don't want to add any new words or anything. I still prefer to use the term Byzantine priority. But hopefully you can see the different ways in which the term majority text has been used and where it is today. And I think for the most part, most people who are going to use the term majority text are very likely going to blanket that in with the other 4 editions, perhaps more. I don't know if there's really any further ones out there. Or they're going to use it as a simple nose counting. And of course, the simple nose counting is a theoretical process and put one of these together. And I don't think you won't actually see that produced. Anyway, brothers and sisters, I hope you found this insightful and helpful. And until next time, we'll see you around.